I'm Bruce Ritchie, and for 30 odd years ministered in the Church of Scotland, various parishes. Spent some time in Africa, in Malawi, teaching in Zomba Theological College, and then also taught at Highland Theological College, UHI, Scottish Church History, Theology of Worship and so on.
Good. And what in the wide world got you interested in writing a book about a man who lived 1,500 years ago?
Well, I taught Scottish Church History for about 10 or 11 years at Highland Theological College. And Columba, of course, was one of the first missionaries to bring Christian faith to Scotland. Not the first, but one of the first. And I wanted to know, what did these early men actually believe? You know, what message did they put over? Not just the facts of what they did and who they encountered, but what was it that actually drove their thinking and sort of drove their faith? Columba was a man who was really driven, and he was driven by certain factors, one of which was a tremendous awareness that he was in a world which was under the authority or under the apparent authority of the demonic. And he believed, as a Christian believer, that Christ had overcome the demonic and that he was involved in the work of Christ, the battle of Christ, in reclaiming souls for the kingdom. And I think at heart that this was a thing that really motivated Columba, that drove him, and really sort of lay at the very heart of his faith.
And had you been looking at this for a number of years?
The book started out as quite a different book. I was wanting to write a book about very early Scottish Church history, up to about the year 700. And then as I researched that, then you discover that Columba is such a central figure. And as I said before, what did he actually believe? What did they actually believe? And so from working on a wider volume, began to narrow down more and more in Columba and sort of go deeper into that and sort of research the sources that we have for Columba and those around him. Yeah.
Now, it is amazing to me that Columba is respected in so many parts of the church, and he's respected in North America, and you have a story about Malawi. Tell us that story.
When I was in Malawi, one of the new churches that was built just outside Blantyre in Malawi was being rededicated, or being dedicated in fact, one Sunday. And the whole presbytery, of course, went for the dedication of this new church, a vast church, enormous church. And because I was from Scotland, I was asked to preach the sermon in English. And the church, they called it St. Columba's. So I decided in the sermon to talk a little bit about who Columba was, some of the principles in his life, and apply that to life and faith in Malawi today. And what was interesting was that although they knew the name Columba, they didn't know who Columba was. But yet they were quite struck by the similarities between Columba's mission and his way of expressing the gospel and the kind of mission and evangelism that goes on in Africa in contemporary society.
Good. Now, what was his view on this subject of spiritual warfare? You hinted at the demonic. How did he think about it, and how did he deal with it?
The subtitle of the book is The Faith of an Island Soldier. And the word soldier is quite significant. If you were a serious Christian in the first few centuries, then that was the title that was given to you. And of course it comes from the New Testament. The idea of battle and warfare. And Columba understood his faith in terms of rescuing men and women from captivity to Satan. Because of sin, because of the fall, men and women have fallen into imprisonment by the evil one. And the work of Christ on the cross is a work to release men and women from that captivity. And so he understands the atonement, he understands the gospel very much in terms of victory over the evil one. And his mission as a Christian, and he would see the mission of the church, being continuing Christ's work in redeeming men and women from that satanic activity. Because the evil one is the prince of the powers of the air, he is the apparent ruler of this world. Men and women are enthralled to him, and they have to be set free from that. And that was how Columba understood salvation, understood redemption. Being set free from Satan, being set free for Christ, by Christ.
And did he say something about the Christ being lifted up on the cross in connection with that?
Yeah. In the New Testament, we have the verse that mentions Satan being prince of the powers of the air. Now, in the first few centuries, not just Columba's time, but before that and after that, that phrase was taken quite literally by nearly every Christian. And they viewed the actual atmosphere as being inhabited by the demonic. And therefore, as he reflected on the cross, one of the things that he would bring out was the fact that when Jesus was lifted up on the cross, he was lifted up into the territory of the demonic. And within the territory of the demonic, he overcomes the demonic. But then there's another aspect. The way that Columba understood things was that at death, for a redeemed soul to get to heaven, they had to pass through the air to get to heaven. So they still had to pass through this realm of the demonic to get to heaven. And therefore, even at the point of death, even if you're a believer, you still had this perilous journey to fulfill. And therefore, Christ had to help you through that final step, a bit like the people of Israel crossing the Jordan into the promised land. And this realm of the air, the atmosphere inhabited by the demonic, was where you could be ambushed, even at the last minute, before you reach glory.
Now, this is a question you might have difficulty answering, because certainly I do. Would he be a Catholic? Would he be Orthodox? Would he be a Reformed Presbyterian? Where would he fit, if he fits at all, in the current scheme of things?
That's a very good question. And because Columba is such an iconic figure, then almost all of these constituencies have claimed him as their own. The Roman Catholic tradition have claimed him, and they would say that their own tradition is in direct continuity with him. Reformed Presbyterianism has claimed him, mainly because he was different from Roman Catholics, and therefore he must be closer to what a Protestant is. The Orthodox might claim him because a lot of what happened in Iona, where Columba was based, the kind of worship, was quite akin to what we might call Eastern Orthodox worship and so on. I think we really have to say that he wasn't any of these. He was early Irish Christian, or as we sometimes say nowadays, early Celtic Christian. And his own faith was fed by the traditional church fathers, Athanasius, Augustine, etc. And he incorporated into that faith some elements that a Protestant or Reformed Presbyterian just could not accept at all. One of the main things would be the whole idea of penance. Because penance was a growing thing, and in the monastic system, especially Columba and Ireland's monastic system, it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually, of course, 1,000 years later, it had to be, that's why we had to have the Reformation. Yes. But yet, Roman Catholics are uncomfortable with him as well, because he didn't acknowledge the authority of the Bishop of Rome or things like that. So you could say he's his own man. He's an early Irish Christian, with his weaknesses, with his strengths.
Now, let's change direction. Did he ever visit Loch Ness?
We think so. His great biographer, Adomnan, certainly writes stories that say that he was at the River Ness. And at the River Ness we have this story of a great water beast that he encountered. And people say that's the origin or an early account of the Loch Ness monster. He also probably visited King Bredy of the Picts at Craigpatrick, which is just outside Inverness. And then just alongside the banks of Inverness, of Loch Ness, you have Glen Urquhart. And one of the stories that Adomnan tells is of a Pictish gentleman being converted to Christ round about Glen Urquhart.
And did he go to Skye?
He went to Skye. That also is mentioned by Adomnan in his life of Columba. We're not told too many details about that, but certainly Skye is mentioned in the account. That they were great travellers, these old Celtic saints.
You know, we all get on planes and trains and cars, and we have the use of the internet to be everywhere. But he seemed to have an impact across the whole of Scotland and large parts of Ireland without any of these facilities.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, obviously he came from Ireland originally, and in fact he was 42 before he actually came to Scotland and came to Iona. So he had quite a ministry in Ireland before crossing the Irish Sea in his curragh. Although it wasn't a sort of one-man curragh, it would be a sort of ocean-going type that would take about 20 or 30 or 40 people in that. Because Columba was such a big figure, then of course as the years went past, people wanted to claim him as being their progenitor of faith. So a lot of places would say, well, Columba came here or Columba came there, when maybe he didn't, but some of his followers did. And it's almost claiming the name of the great man. The most recent scholarship affirms that his area of greatest influence would be limited to Argyll and then up the Great Glen, if the King Bredy stories are true, which we think they are. Yeah.
Now, what was his part in the use of the sign of the cross?
Remember how we said before that in his cosmology, he saw the physical atmosphere being inhabited by the demonic. Mm-hmm. And he understood Calvary in terms of Jesus being lifted up on the cross into the realm of the demonic and engaging with them and overcoming them. Now, when Columba used the sign of the cross, he didn't use it superstitiously. What he was doing was making a sign in the air where the demonic was understood to reside. And by making the sign of the cross in the air, he was placing Christ there. He was engaging in warfare by making the sign of the cross. And he was proclaiming in a physical sign that Christ was the victor. And in proclaiming Christ, he believed that when you made the sign of the cross, then the demonic had to retreat. So he was expressing the victory of Christ over the demonic as he saw it.
Where was he in relation to one of the doctrines that's under attack today, the final things, the doctrine of the reality of the judgment seat and hell and heaven?
We have very few writings that we can say actually came from the pen or the quill of Columba. There is one that scholars are quite confident he wrote called the Altus Prosator. And in the Altus Prosator it's quite clear where Columba says that no one should doubt that there is a heaven above and there is a hell below. And he saw mission, he saw evangelism very much in terms of rescuing men and women from an eternity in hell. And for him, that was a basic assumption of his whole ministry. Some modern Celtic studies tried to look at the Celtic saints and say, well, what they were really interested in was justice and peace. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that that's true, but that wasn't what drove them in their hearts. What drove them was rescuing men and women from a lost eternity.
And is that something that the church today might be better off recovering?
It's a biblical truth, and therefore it's something that has to be emphasized. And it's also the way we interpret the gospel in terms of it's God's rescue mission. It's not just God's bestowal of a blessing, it's God's rescue mission. And certainly in terms of rescue mission, that's how Columba would see it. I think that's how the New Testament sees it. And therefore, because of that, the church also has to focus on that.
How did he do his evangelism? Well, what did he do? He didn't have radio, he didn't have books. How did he do it? What did he actually do?
As we understand it, what he would do was he would go to an area or he'd go to a place and he would simply proclaim the reality of God and the reality of the cross. He wouldn't attempt to argue the case, but because he saw evangelism in terms of spiritual warfare, he believed that when he announced who the true God was, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and when he announced that Christ had overcome evil on the cross, then that announcement itself was enough to begin to break the power of evil over a community or over an individual. And then when that community or individual were freed from enslavement to the power of evil, they would almost naturally come to faith. They would almost naturally respond. But the important thing was to herald who God was and what he had done.
So, if you were able to have a chat with Columba today, what question might you ask him? You know, if he appeared here and you had a minute to ask him a question or two, what would you say to him?
I don't think I'd ask him a question. If I only had a minute, I'd try and tell him something.
Good?
I'd try and tell him that the gospel is really about the pure grace of God saving us. And it's not anything to do with what we are able to achieve. Because I think that this is the one area in which Columba and his contemporaries were not clear. They saw salvation in terms of almost a combination of human effort and God's grace. It's what we call semi-Pelagianism. Yeah. And that was to afflict the church for centuries. This idea that it's partly what I do, partly what God does. So I think I'd want to point out the New Testament teaching that says, no, it's simply what God does.
Ah, good. That's lovely. And we need to hear that always, often. Thanks for saying that. But you still have another minute to ask him a question.
There's various questions I could ask. You know, when people read a Dominican's life of Columba, they say, was that particular story true, or was that story made up by a Dominican to add some luster to his hero? So I'd want to ask him about various historical facts. You know, did you actually do this? Did you actually go there? And so on. So I think that these would be the kind of questions which, as a historian, I would want to ask him. Yeah. I'd also want to ask him about the kind of worship that he had on Iona. You know, how he understood worship, what the monks did as they worshipped. Because certainly in the research I did for the book, this was something I found myself getting into deeper and deeper. And I found it quite an enhancement to my own faith, just reflecting on their own devotional life.
Expand on that. What attracted you or impacted you from how you gather they did worship. Was there a significant connection with psalmody? The Psalms seemed to be something that he was attracted to.
What the monks tried to do in their communal life was to replicate what they believed was the worship that took place in heaven. And in heaven, worship is continual. And they believed that a pure Christian should be able to worship continually. Now, of course, we have to eat, we have to sleep, and so on, so we can't do that, so our worship is imperfect according to that particular criteria. But they tried to approximate that by having the regular times of worship, various canonical hours of worship when they went and they sang psalms. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that worship was very much based on singing the psalms. But they also included singing some very early Christian hymns, written by some of the early church fathers as well. And so I think there'd be loads of questions about what they sang, how they understood it, how that impacted on their own feelings of piety, how it enabled their faith to grow, or whether it became an obstacle as they tried to almost overdo it in almost an attempt to be sort of perfect and pure and render a perfect worship to God.
Right, one final question. You have a moment or two to encourage the listener to this to read this book and think about Columba. And you have a minute or two to tell them why this is something that was on your heart and why it might benefit them.
What I've tried to do in the book is to look at an aspect of Columba's life that I think hasn't been looked at before. Namely, to look at his theology, to look at his faith, to look at his worship, to look at how he understood Christianity. And I think that one of the things I would take away from that would be perhaps what Columba might say to the modern church. And what Columba might say would be, have confidence in what you believe about God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Have confidence in what you believe about the cross, that it is Christ's victory. Don't be worried by the fact that in the modern era you're taking the gospel into a non-Christian culture, because that's what I did. And I took it to people who were unaware of the kind of thinking that's involved in the gospel. But have confidence that when you proclaim Christ, when you lift up his name, when you make it clear as to what it's all about, then the Spirit will break through every barrier and people can come to faith.
Bruce, thank you very much. I certainly have greatly appreciated the little chat we've had, and what I've read of your work on Columba has been heartwarming and challenging. I have questions that I would like to ask him too. And someday, sometime in God's mysterious providence, we expect to be not only with Columba, but with Christ, which is far better.
Absolutely.
Thank you.